G'day, ZiggyD here, and in this video I'm going to be giving you guys another skill gem analysis, this time for patch 1.2's new bow skill, Tornado Shot. I've been playing a character built around this new skill for quite a while now, and I've also had a chance to chat to one of the developers, Rory, who worked on the skill in a fair bit of detail about its mechanics. It's one of the more interesting and complicated skills that's been added into the game in, well, pretty much as long as I can remember. The simple sort of function of the skill is quite, simple. The basic function of it is quite simple. But the ways at which it can be used and the ways it can be modified with things like lesser multiple projectiles and greater multiple projectiles and how they interact with mobs and where you fire and your aim and things like that, that's where things get a little bit more convoluted and a little bit more complex. So hopefully I can break things down for you guys in this video and give you guys some idea of in what ways it's actually useful, because it's one of those skills where when you first kind of use it, you're just like, how is this any better than split arrow, or how is it any different to split arrow, or why would I use this? It seems pretty weak on first impressions, and I certainly got that impression when I first started using it. I thought it was pretty lackluster, but the more I learnt about the skill and its mechanics, and the more I sort of practiced with it, because it is one that requires a fair bit of practice to actually use correctly, the more and more attached I got to it, and I actually like it far more than split arrow now. So let's jump into breaking down some of the mechanics. So the description for Tornado Shot sort of gives you a good rundown of the basic the way it functions. Fires a piercing shot that travels until it reaches a targeted location, so it's ground targeted. It will then fire projectiles out in all directions from that point. So, the way this works, I have set up a little target range over here, and my little Exile friend here has gladly volunteered to, well, maybe not gladly, but he's volunteered to help demonstrate this particular situation. Now, this first shot is a piercing shot, so if we pretend this guy's a mob, the first arrow will pierce through the mob, and then there'll be 3 other arrows thrown out in random directions. So we can see this just by firing there. We can see an explosion animation play just here, and 3 projectiles went out in different directions. Now if I fire in that exact same spot, and I can do this a couple times, you'll see the arrows, where the arrows actually fall, is indeed randomized. So, that's pretty random. I can't really see any actual correlation. We can eventually fill this spot up with arrows there. There's some light grouping going on based on where I'm shooting there, but eventually we're going to kind of fill that whole area with arrows. So, this is kind of a pseudo AoE skill. Yeah, it seems like it's sort of an AoE skill. When things get interesting is when you add lesser multiple projectiles into the mix. What happens is, if we put lesser multiple projectiles, we fire 3 piercing shots, which then fire 3 additional shots. Now, the lesser multiple projectiles does not apply to the explosion, the secondary effect. So each arrow still only releases 3 more arrows. But what happens then, I'm actually going to reset this zone so you guys can get a bit of a better idea of the arrows, is that this skill actually becomes a very potent single target skill, which seems kind of unusual, putting less multiple projectiles on something to make it a potent single target skill. You can see the way the arrows are grouped there. One even flew out back past me. My cover is not very protective. But what actually happens is better described with a diagram, I think. So let me bring up my crappy Photoshop. Here we go. Prepare yourselves for the awesomeness that is this. So what we have is the initial projectiles with less multiple projectiles. Each one of these pierces, so you can hit the mob you're targeting, or let's say this is Piety just here. You can hit Piety with the first piercing projectiles. Now it's impossible to get these to shotgun. Even if a mob is just standing here, only one of the piercing projectiles will hit that mob. But what happens then with the secondary projectiles is pretty interesting. If you fire just behind a mob, so I'm talking the aim is kind of just here behind a mob, and maybe I can bring up a little demonstration with Kaduku on screen for you as well. If you fire just behind a mob, there's actually a convergence point where you will hit the same mob with 4 total projectiles. So the total damage for this ends up becoming quite high, and much higher than if you had have just hit them with the single projectile from a lesser multiple projectile shot. So on the diagram, this looks a bit like this. We have the 3 exploding projectiles. We have 1, 2, 3. This one of these hits. 1, 2, 3. One of these hits. 1, 2, 3. One of these hits. Now, the way that these kind of rotate, or there's a quirk with the game where when they're grouped that closely, because these are always grouped together with less multiple projectiles, there is always that convergence spot on the mob where it gets hit by multiple projectiles. I did confirm this with Rory, and he's what gave me this idea that this is actually a very potent single target skill. Now, I think at this point it's important to clarify a few things and a few misconceptions about the skill. The explosion animation is not an AoE. The skill is not tagged with the AoE, so conc effect, concentrated effect, or increased AoE, or anything that changes area of effect damage does not work with Tornado Shot. It's not an AoE skill. However, it does have area of effect applications because of the sheer amount of projectiles it puts out. Now, if we switch over from lesser multiple projectiles to greater multiple projectiles, we get the same sort of deal. We fire 5 projectiles, and each one of those projectiles releases 3 extra projectiles. The total projectiles being 20 projectiles then. And the sheer amount of projectiles you put out with this ends up being really quite effective. And I actually found when doing Lunaris runs and clearing maps that GMP for AoE purposes was superior or easier to use than lesser multiple projectiles. Now, although lesser multiple projectiles, because of the way that the damage multiplier works and because of the way that the arrows converge, has superior single target with still some AoE applications, and even with very good aim, so if you're constantly aiming just behind mobs that you're targeting, you will deal overall a lot more damage. The effect of it is that most of the time your clear speed is a bit lower because you are getting into situations where you're having to single target mobs all the time rather than just clearing them with one AoE shot. So I found that although you get a little bit of reduced damage effectiveness with GMP, the sheer amount of arrows and because of the randomization in which those arrows fly out makes it much more reliable and easy to use skill. So let's talk a little bit about the way Tornado Shot scales. Tornado Shot is the only projectile attack or the only bow skill that has a more damage multiplier. It starts off at level 1 at deals 90% of base damage. Usually this is something like a built-in stat for the skill that cannot change. I should have a split arrow I can show here, which says deals 80% of base damage, and that doesn't change at all throughout no matter how much you level up Split Arrow. Instead, you get an increased physical damage, so you have that less multiplier, so basically lopping 1/5 of your damage off, but then you get to increase it from that new base, so the damage total effectiveness is lower. But when you have a more multiplier like this, is once that you actually level this skill up, it goes all the way up to over 109% if you overlevel the skill. So at level 17 here I'm at deals 106% of base damage. So once I got to the 100%, it was dealing full damage effectiveness while shooting out 4 projectiles. So each single shot without lesser or greater multiple projectiles shoots out 4 projectiles at full damage effectiveness. So the math there on paper is very good, is very solid. And then as you level it up even further than that, you actually get increased base damage effectiveness. Now this sort of, I'm playing a physical spec, and I've found physical Tornado Shot to be quite effective, but I do think there is really good potential of Tornado Shot with an elemental build as well, because of the way that scales additive damage. Things like Wrath and Anger and Added Lightning and all that sort of stuff will scale very nicely with the more damage multiplier, and the math for the skill works out to be very good. So how is it just not, with the math being so good, super superior to Split Arrow? The reason is that it's much harder to use than Split Arrow. When I was talking to Rory, it pretty much, I suggested that it seems like a skill that is built to have a higher skill cap to sort of distinguish players that are very skilled with it. And he said pretty much that was the case, that they are interested in the idea of having skills that a really good or experienced player with that skill will get far more damage effectiveness with it. So indeed, in the example of lesser multiple projectiles here, an experienced player will deal 4 times the amount of damage than an inexperienced player will deal. So an inexperienced player might target all the way behind and only hit the mob with 1 projectile, or maybe 2 projectiles if they're lucky, depending on the random grouping. Or they might fire beforehand, only hit the mob with 1 projectile, or they might just miss completely and only hit with the stray projectiles. So that is like an inexperienced player. And when you're moving about and trying to dodge attacks yourself and using all your other skills and stuff like that, that's pretty easy to do, to whiff those attacks. But an experienced player with the skill, someone who has practiced with it quite a bit, will hit that sweet point. They will hit that convergence point and deal 4 times the damage because they will hit that same mob with 4 projectiles. So there is that sort of high skill cap. A similar thing does happen with GMP, though it's a little bit less noticeable. GMP kind of removes some of the player error by putting out a huge amount of extra arrows. So generally with GMP, the strategy when you're clearing packs is to aim, I generally aim 2/3 through the pack. So let me find some way to demonstrate this for you guys. Okay, let's say this circle just here is a group of very tightly clustered zombies, right? There's a massive group of zombies just in here. Now, the best spot to fire with GMP on Tornado Shot is going to be 2/3 through the pack just here. What this does essentially is, if I can get this to actually proc there, because the raised effect is kind of confusing me a bit. Firing 2/3 through the pack means that all of the maximum amount of piercing is happening that can happen without wasting any of your extra arrows. So essentially, I am piercing 2/3 of the pack with my initial shots, so they're all getting hit by those piercing projectiles. And then the secondary projectiles are not getting wasted. So if I were to fire completely behind the pack, sure, I'll hit more with the piercing projectiles, but the huge amount of extra projectiles that gets fires out, less than half of them is actually going to be hitting the pack. Whereas if I do get it in that pack just there, like that, every single projectile should be getting soaked up by a mob or close there too. So that's how to sort of maximize your damage effectiveness with GMP just there. Now let's talk a little bit about support gems and scaling Tornado Shot. Generally, the standard sort of ways of scaling it apply. Using faster attacks is always going to be good. Using added fire on a fizz spec is good. Using physical projectile attack damage is always going to be good too. Anything that modifies projectile damage or leverages your physical damage or increases your elemental damage, like Weapon Ellie, is going to be a good way to scale it, of course. So that all remains pretty much the same. Where it diverges a bit is how you sort of leverage the secondary effects of the skill. So, as I was talking about, I use both less multiple projectiles and greater multiple projectiles depending on the situation. LMP is actually better single target than using it as a single target skill. So doing it like this is pretty average single target. It's not very different to using just a standard attack, like a default attack. But when you add LMP, you can get up to 4 times the damage. So for example, what I'll do is I'll run with greater multiple projectiles in Lunaris, clearing packs much more quickly and much more easily. And then when I get to Piety, I'll switch over to lesser multiple projectiles and leverage that higher single target damage against her. I use Puncture in my build as well, so I puncture and then I fire Tornado Shot. The puncture effect takes effect, and then Tornado Shot deals damage. As a little interesting side note, with King of the Hill in a crit bow build, the knockback effect on Tornado Shot is amazing. It's really, really good because of the sheer number of projectiles you can hit a single mob with less multiple projectiles if you crit, because like every other skill in Path of Exile, it's determined upon firing. So if this is determined to be a crit, every single projectile will crit, which means if you hit the same mob with 4 projectiles, they will each hit at different times. The first one will hit, then it'll go bam, 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 hit the other ones really quickly. You actually knock them back 4 times. So what happens is I'll puncture Piety, which puncture deals 5 times the amount of damage over time. If the mob is being knocked back, or if the mob is moving in general, and knockback counts as moving for the purposes of that. So what I'll do is I'll puncture the mob, get a crit puncture, and then fire, and it'll knock them back 4 times in rapid succession, which really amplifies that damage for a good extra second. And as long as I'm firing pretty quickly like that, you're going to get really good damage effectiveness there from your puncture skill. Next up, I think in an elemental spec, GMP and Chain will work really well. I think even there's some potential for that in a physical spec as well, with the sheer amount of projectiles you're putting out, and if you are aiming them correctly, so getting it 2/3 of the way through the pack, like I said, the secondary projectiles don't have a built-in pierce, so they can indeed chain. And with the number of projectiles you'd be putting out, if you're getting as many of those as possible to connect, chaining should be very effective, so I do think that is a decent option to explore. However, what I've gone for in my particular spec, and this was somewhat influenced by 2 things. One was the drop of a drill neck, and the other was a discussion I had with Rory about this skill. I'm actually using Pierce. Now this seems kind of dumb, and often when I say my support gems include Pierce, I get called an idiot. But, because, obviously because the first projectile pierces, why would you put Pierce when the skill already pierces? The secondary projectiles don't pierce, and there are some really nice benefits to adding that Pierce just there. Rory said that in their testing they found that it functions pretty decently with Pierce, for example, even though only the secondary projectiles gets benefits from it. And after testing for myself, influenced by getting that drill neck, because obviously I get an increase in damage as well using Pierce, I did find that the AoE potential with GMP especially, but even with the LMP, improved pretty dramatically. It just means that with all of those arrows hitting out, they do extend all the way back through the pack. So what happens when I'm firing GMP with Pierce, and my current skill set up has 96% chance to pierce, so it's pretty much guaranteed. I'll fire 2/3 of the way through that pack, and then all of the arrows that then fire back in this direction, back through the pack, or even into other packs that are off screen, which I'll often wander around and find packs half dead off screen. All of these arrows pierce back through the entire thing, so essentially what's happening is it's kind of like Projectile Return, that crazy new mod. I'm firing my projectiles and then half of the damage is actually returning back through the pack and cleaning up the rest of that. And just my overall clear speed improved pretty dramatically with Pierce, even without the drill neck, even testing without the drill neck to try and mitigate like that damage increase. Was it just a damage increase? But I actually found Pierce worked pretty well. So I do think Pierce and Chain have pretty good potential. I don't know about Fork. It could be something you could test out, but Fork doesn't really seem like to me like it would be particularly useful. But then again, with this skill, it doesn't seem particularly useful in general until you actually sort of learn how to position it correctly, and maybe Fork would be good if you learn a certain way to place the skill essentially so that it gets maximum possible forking. But the fact that it is a skill that has a built-in pierce on a first stage of the skill and then a secondary effect that you can modify in kind of any way you want makes this a very interesting skill, and something that you can really change your playstyle around based on the support gem selection you use and to where you actually fire the skill. So I think after all of this testing, and I'm still going to take it further and further into endgame, and I'm constantly going back and comparing it to Split Arrow, and the last couple times that I've compared it to Split Arrow, I felt like my clear speed was much lower with Split Arrow, and Split Arrow felt a little bit more awkward to use for me, especially damage against like smaller groups or against single targets felt a lot better with Tornado Shot because of the multiple arrows hitting different mobs. So I think overall my impressions so far are that Tornado Shot is much more tiring to use. It's much more difficult to use. It is ground targeted, and because the projectiles always group together, you really always have to be very spot on with where you're firing. And this can get a bit tiring, especially when you've been farming for a few hours, and you're always having to, if I'm kiting for example, I'll have to click over here and then move my mouse all the way back out over in that direction. With Split Arrow, that's not quite as pronounced because you can essentially just point in the right direction and you're fine, so you can kind of just do this. It doesn't really matter so much. Like the spread modifies, sure, but as long as you're kind of a little bit far away from your character, it's not a big deal. But with Tornado Shot, you're kind of doing all of this, really modifying the way you shoot. However, I found it's useful in more situations for me than Split Arrow. Split Arrow is only very useful when you're when mobs are all in one sort of like either lined up or on one side of you. When they're sort of grouped around you, it gets pretty difficult to actually do any sort of useful targeting, and if they're on the other side of you, it becomes pretty much useless, whereas Tornado Shot still fires out in all directions, so if you're surrounded, you can actually kind of just like pick a mob, fire on it, and you're still shooting. Like, look at the amount of arrows firing behind me there as well. So overall, I found that, although it's a bit more tiring and harder to use and requires a bit more practice to actually use the skill correctly, I found it useful in more situations than Split. I'm sure this will be a skill that people fall on either side of the category. Some people really prefer Split, some people prefer Tornado Shot, but I do think it's a viable alternative, and I think it has a lot of potential. So I'll leave you guys with the end of this video with a quote from Rory here. Rory said, "I'm really curious to see how it develops. It's one of those skills that'll need reactive balance, as who knows how well it'll perform after players have become really experienced with it." And I do think that's the case. I think it's a skill with a lot of potential, and I'm very interested to see what players more skilled and knowledgeable than myself can make of it when I've already found it to be quite effective. So anyway, hopefully you guys found this video interesting. That's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.